It's sunrise over the northern Cape Breton highlands, just east of Bay St. Lawrence. The October air has brought with it a chill. But dawn, rising over the Cabot Strait in the Atlantic Ocean, is just stunning. And it's here, on the Cosman Trail, that I'm on my walkabout today. The Cosman Trail has been called the lesser-known Skyline Trail. Skyline is, of course, a well-known hiking destination in the Cape Breton highlands on the west side of the island near Cheticamp. Much like that trail, this route will eventually take me out onto a dramatic plateau overlooking the water, but one without boardwalks and interpretive signage. One that is almost certainly less crowded, even on its busiest days, but one which can be equally as dramatic. This trail was once called the Rasmussen-McLaughlin Trail, although these days, if you're looking for information on it, you're more likely to find it by searching Cosman. Now, talking to some locals here, the Rasmussen name comes from Dave Rasmussen. In fact, some people even call it Dave's Trail, who blazed this trail and actually maintained it for a long time. Apparently, he lived down in Bay St. Lawrence. The Cosman name comes from an American who summered up this way and was a world-renowned scientist involved in one of the most significant research projects in human history. Walter Cosman was born in Mount Vernon, New York in 1916. He received his PhD in chemistry from Princeton University in 1940. Being wartime, Cosman, who was doing groundbreaking work studying the behavior of liquids at low temperatures, joined a war research laboratory in Pittsburgh. By 1944, he was working in Los Alamos, New Mexico on the Manhattan Project, where he would ultimately be involved in the development of the atomic bomb. Cosman appears to have viewed the Manhattan Project just like he would any other research project. In fact, he tells a story of being reprimanded by Robert Oppenheimer when he once led a cross-country ski trip and someone broke their leg, delaying progress on the development of the atomic bomb. Cosman was responsible for the development of the detonator on the Trinity test, which was the very first atomic bomb, as well as on the Fat Man plutonium bomb, which was dropped on Nagasaki, leading to the surrender of Japan. Sometimes it's a little hard to rationalize work on the atomic bomb. It's easy to wonder what the scientists themselves may have been thinking. But we know what Cosman was thinking. In 1996, he wrote a letter to a grandnephew saying, quote, "We believe that if the atomic bomb could be made, it was of the utmost importance that we exert every effort to make it and to use it before the present war was over. Then the world would know that this dreadful weapon had arrived on the scene. And further, that it is so dreadful that another world war would be unthinkable." Cosman's research was not limited to the atomic bomb. He is famous for work in chemistry, in particular around how liquids behave at supercooled temperatures, as well as how proteins behave. A lot of his research and findings actually have laid the groundwork for today's modern science. To this point, you'd be forgiven if you couldn't figure out the connection to a trail in Cape Breton. But Walter Cosman was more than just a famous and influential scientist, though he was connected to Nova Scotia in that way too, as a periodic visiting scientist at Dalhousie University. He and his wife Elizabeth were married in 1951, and almost immediately they began summering in Cape Breton. One of his favorite pastimes was exploring the highlands, following old animal and human trails, as well as cutting his own trails. There is a story from August 1970 that took place not too far from here, where Cosman led his and another family through the woods on a route which was impassable, or at least they were told was impassable. He didn't believe them. Machete in hand, they made their way through, but the going was so tough, they ended up overnighting in the woods. In 2000, Walter and Elizabeth Cosman donated 40 acres of land around Aspy Bay, including a kilometer of shoreline, to the Nova Scotia Nature Trust. They were the first Americans to make a donation of land to the trust. It's a parcel where Walter had been using his scientific skills to measure the impacts of shoreline loss. Walter Cosman died in 2009. His wife predeceased him by 5 years. Well, this view and this last few hundred meters of trail is why people come here. When I started my journey, I referenced the fact that this is not a national park trail like Skyline. As you near the end of the hike, heading up onto the ridge, you want to be careful and stay in the middle. Just like Skyline, it can be very windy at times here, and it's a 1,000-foot drop to the bottom, to a gorge on one side, and a 1,000-foot drop to the Atlantic Ocean on the other. 300 kilometers away, due east into the rising sun, is the French port of Saint-Pierre-Miquelon, an unlikely outpost of Europe, which still remains on the edge of Canada. And beyond that, the island of Newfoundland, which can also be reached 100 kilometers to the northeast. The waters in between, home to so much over the years, from explorers to transport ships, military endeavors, fishermen, ferries, and passenger liners. The road to get to this trail is tough. In fact, it's really just used mostly for accessing work sites and of course to do the hiking trails in this area. But if you're willing to travel that 6 kilometers to the trailhead and then hike out here onto this ridge, the views and the landscape are absolutely stunning in any season. This is pretty hard to top, especially hiking out here at daybreak. But I'm willing to try, so after the break, I'm headed to Meat Cove. Won't you be mine? Feel the sunshine. It was cool overnight in northern Cape Breton, and as such, the leaves on the trees are starting to change. Some mountains are still completely green, while others are covered in hues of various colors dotting the landscape. Looking out on the Cabot Strait, Meat Cove, the most northerly community in Cape Breton. And it's here, going up to the top of Meat Cove Mountain, that I'm on my walkabout today. At one time, it was moose and caribou people came here for in the fall. But these days, it's mostly the fall colors. And it's interesting to think about why trees change color at all. This green all around me over the next few days is going to turn into vibrant color. I think most people realize there are two types of trees. There's coniferous, or evergreens, and deciduous. And it's the deciduous that change. And that happens as the sunlight during the days gets shorter and the chlorophyll starts to leave the leaves and go back into the tree. You may notice that in some years the leaves in an area are more vibrant than others. This is simply a factor of weather. The most intense colors will usually be seen after a hot, dry summer, followed by a quick switch to cold nights. When you hear people say it feels like autumn arrived suddenly, that might be a shock to the system, but it's really good for vibrantly colored foliage. In contrast, if you have a very sunny fall and sudden prolonged cold snap, some trees will skip the pretty colors entirely, and the leaves will die, turning brown. If you're coming to Cape Breton to see the leaves change, it can be very hard to predict when to come. It's October here, and I've been here at this time of year before and seen this foliage just in spectacular, almost bloom, if you will. But this year, the leaves are a little late, and that could be a sign of a number of things. There's some research being done at Appalachian State University talking about the impact of climate change on the changing leaves, and one of the things they found is that the change in worldwide temperatures might actually shift when and how those leaves change. Now, that might seem trivial. It means that you see a later or shorter period of color, but it could be much more serious than that, because the trees need to reabsorb that chlorophyll. They need the sugars. And so it could impact the tree's physiology. And that might be why at times like this, we are seeing later and later changes in color. Some say it might just be the canary in the coal mine for climate change. The reason leaves of trees change color in the first place before they fall off is because they've adapted to save chlorophyll. It takes a lot of energy for a tree to make that chemical, so as the days get shorter, the trees attempt to reabsorb what chlorophyll they can to use again in the spring. As the chlorophyll exits the leaves, the true color, hidden in the summer by the green, starts to come out, and the yellow and orange pigments become visible. So why do trees like red maples, oaks, and dogwood go red rather than orange or yellow? This is because of a chemical change where sugars are trapped in the leaves and produce colors that weren't part of the leaf during the growing season. I'm surrounded here by birch trees, which are slowly going yellow, but if I was in a forest with maple trees, of course, they would be turning red. And there's a lot of research into why trees turn red in the first place. We know the chemical reason, the sugar, but evolutionarily, why? Well, there are a few different theories. One of them is that the red color attracts birds, which might help spread seeds, for example, the dogwood, and that would ensure the species survival. Another one is to act as a warning so parasitic insects don't lay their eggs over winter and kill the trees. And yet another one is that perhaps the red color acts almost like a sunscreen, so when that chlorophyll is going back into the tree, the leaves are protected. Meat Cove is the place where the road ends, literally. Getting here means traveling an old road, hugging hillsides, and entering a dramatic ravine carved over time by water. It's hard to imagine how settlers first decided this would be a good place to live, being so difficult to reach. But it's likely Europeans first arrived in the cove by boat. From at least the 17th century, ships would stop in this protected cove to fill up on water and food, where moose and caribou were plentiful. It's said the name Meat Cove actually originates from the fact that as people were sailing by, they could smell moose and caribou being cooked along the shore. The main industry in Meat Cove has always been fishing, but in the 1950s, zinc was found in the area, and there was talk of a mine being developed. It never came to pass. Recently, tourism has seen a big push in this area, with Meat Cove being the launching point for one end of the proposed seawall trail. The Meat Cove Internet Cafe and Welcome Center provides information on hiking in the area, as well as information on trail conditions. Meat Cove was never very big population-wise, and it still isn't today. In 1956, the population was 55. These days, it's not much more than 60. Living in Meat Cove could be tough. It's still tough today. At times, the one road in and out of the community can be washed out in major storms. There's a story from March 1926 when there were only 5 families living here. Winter had a real tight grip on the area, and food was becoming in short supply. Word was that there really were no supplies in nearby communities either. Those would have been hard to reach in any event. And so it was that a group of men went out on the pack ice and headed 65 kilometers to Pleasant Bay. After 4 days, they returned, tired, probably lost a lot of weight in that time, but they had supplies and made it through spring. Autumn and fall are used interchangeably. Autumn was the word used for this season in the 14th century, and it was in the 17th century in England when fall came into vogue, literally referring to the fall of the leaves, something which is just beginning to happen around here now. Incidentally, spring, well, spring refers to the springing or growth of leaves. Whatever you choose to call it, it's an absolutely beautiful time of year to get out and hike, especially in the mountains of northern Cape Breton. And after the break, there's one more I want to tackle, the tallest in Nova Scotia, Wilkie Sugarloaf.
Won't you be mine? Feel the sunshine.
Well, after hiking across two mountains, why not make it the perfect trifecta by hiking the tallest peak in all of Nova Scotia? Not too far from the community of Dingwall, still in northern Cape Breton, is Wilkie Sugarloaf. It's a short trail, but very steep to the top of the mountain. The fall colors are just starting to come out on the mountain, and I have my hiking pole with me because I might need it for this one. And it's where I'm on my walkabout today. This hike takes you to the top of the highest mountain in Nova Scotia, but not the highest point. Measured from the base of the mountain to the top, this is the tallest at 412 meters, but only the fourth highest peak. White Hill at 535 meters is the highest point in the province, and that's located a little south of here in the center of the Cape Breton Highlands National Park, west of Ingonish. One of the things I'm very thankful for is the volunteers who do trail maintenance along here. It certainly makes it a lot easier getting through places like this. Now, if you're confused about the issue of tallest versus highest, don't be too hard on yourself. I had to do a deep dive in the research to figure this one out myself. It turns out in Nova Scotia, there are relatively few standalone mountains. That is, mountains that you can actually measure from their base to the peak. This is one of them. Most mountains are part of a range and have plateaus and so forth. This is part of the North Mountain Range of the Aspy Fault, but it is separated by two very deep ravines, Wilkie and Polly's Brook, on either side. Thus, you can measure the exact height of this mountain. You can't do that in places like White's Hill, where the mountain is rather indistinct from nearby mountains, which kind of makes this hike fun. If you complete the hike, you can tell all your friends you have hiked to the tallest mountain in Nova Scotia. This is why, while this trail is among the shortest I've tackled recently in distance, at only about 1.5 kilometers, it is actually one of the more challenging because it gains a lot of elevation over a very short distance. It makes for a hike that, while not particularly lengthy, is one you want to take your time with, as it will take longer than the distance alone might suggest. Most people will take about 2 hours or more to complete this round trip of slightly over 3 kilometers. Wilkie Sugarloaf sounds like an odd name, but it's actually a combination of a person's name and a geographic description. The name has been official since April 21st, 1936, but it has appeared on Admiralty charts since 1860. The Mi'kmaq also had a name for this mountain. They called it Squatch, which means highest peak. Seems fitting. The name Wilkie originates with an early pioneer family who settled in the area in the 1820s. In 1852, John Wilkie Jr. became one of the original land grant recipients around here. Wilkie is an old German name, which in English would be William. It translates to will helmet, which in turn works its way down from a combination of will, or desire, and helmet, or protector, to be understood as resolute protector. There are a few different versions of the name in English and German, such as Wilhelm, Wilkin, which itself is a pet form of William, and of course Wilkie, all meaning the same thing. Okay, so then there is the term Sugarloaf. If you're familiar with skiing, you're probably familiar with Sugarloaf Mountain in Maine. It's kind of a funny name because Sugarloaf is actually the description of a shape. And what they're really saying is the mountain that looks like a sugarloaf. Here, instead of saying Wilkie Mountain, they call it Wilkie Sugarloaf. Back down to that famous ski hill, they named it the mountain that looks like a sugarloaf, but that would not have been terribly specific. There's lots of mountains that look like a sugarloaf. Most people today wouldn't immediately recognize what a sugarloaf is, but they first appeared in Jordan in the 12th century. And until the late 19th century, it was the most common form in which refined sugar was produced and sold. A sugarloaf is a tall cone with a rounded top. People had sugar nips at home, which looked a little bit like a set of calipers or pliers, which they would use to break off the sugar. The size of the sugarloaf was important. A larger loaf generally meant poorer quality sugar. There is also a little bit of colonial history tied to the loaves. Caribbean countries where sugarcane originated were hit with punishing taxes if they tried to refine the sugar and sell it to Britain. They could only sell the dark molasses in barrels to Britain, where it would be refined in the UK. By the 20th century, sugar loaves had been replaced by granulated sugar and sugar cubes. I've reached the peak of the mountain, over 410 meters above the base. This peak is the site of a geodetic survey marker. It's right here. Hasn't been used very much since the advent of GPS, but it still appears as a station on the Government of Canada website. Before GPS, surveyors would hike up this mountain and they would use this as a known spot from which they could do their surveys. These survey markers are important, especially in mountainous regions like Cape Breton, because of the curvature of the Earth. The curvature means you can't just measure a line between 2 points and get an accurate distance. In fact, the measurement becomes less and less accurate the longer the distance. So a special type of survey is done called a geodetic survey, which takes this curve into account. This is such a beautiful place and such a magnificent view here at the end of the day as the sun is setting beyond the highlands. Down here, Dingwall. Over in that direction, St. Paul's Island in Newfoundland, Money Point, all places beckoning people to come explore. You know, Ernest Hemingway once wrote that it's good to have an end to journey towards, but it's the journey that matters in the end. And that's what I hope for you, that it's the journey that excites you on your next walkabout.
Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Oh, hey, oh, hey, feel the sunshine. Oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, feel the sunshine. Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Hey, come on, feel the sunshine.